booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Our book today is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. Our guest is my former student from my time as a West Point professor, Abby. Welcome to the show. Please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
My name is Abby. I'm a human. I went to West Point for 2 years, and then I left and became a police officer for the last 9 years. And then I finished up my degree at the University of Houston with a major in biology and a minor in philosophy.
Great. Thank you so much. Now let's talk about the book. Set on a terraformed Mars in the distant future, Red Rising depicts a society governed by a rigid, color-coded caste system. At the bottom are the Reds, manual laborers who toil in hazardous underground mines. They believe they are pioneers, working to make the planet's surface habitable for future generations. At the top are the Golds, the genetically enhanced ruling elite who live in opulence. The story follows Darrow, a 16-year-old hell diver, the most dangerous job in the mines. After his wife, Io, is executed for singing a forbidden song of rebellion, Darrow discovers a devastating truth. Mars has been habitable for centuries. The Golds have been living on the surface in luxury, using the Reds as enslaved labor to fuel their empire. Driven by grief and a desire for justice, Darrow joins a rebel group known as the Sons of Ares. To dismantle the hierarchy, he undergoes a grueling, year-long physical and mental transformation to pass as a Gold. His mission is to infiltrate the Institute, an elite military academy where young Golds are pitted against each other in a brutal Lord of the Flies-style war for dominance. To rise through the ranks of the elite, Darrow is forced to study the cruel mechanics of Gold supremacy, learning that true liberation requires more than just heart. It requires a mastery of the very power structures that keep his people enslaved. He must navigate a world of shifting alliances and cold-blooded strategy, proving that he can outthink his oppressors at their own game if he ever hopes to one day break their chains. While Red Rising hasn't faced a singular nationwide ban, its history is a prime example of the quote-unquote quiet censorship that often happens within school districts and local libraries. Because the book is marketed as young adult, but contains adult-level stakes, it frequently finds itself at the center of community debates. The book occupies a difficult space between YA and adult fiction. While its protagonists are teenagers, the narrative includes graphic violence, mild depictions of sexual exploitation, and frequent profanity. This has led many school districts, particularly in the southern United States, to remove the book from middle school shelves, arguing that it is not age appropriate for younger readers. Beyond the violence, the book has been challenged for its anti-authoritarian themes. Some local boards have flagged the story as, quote, politically divisive or subversive, unquote, because it centers on the systematic dismantling of a rigid traditionalist social order. In recent years, Red Rising and its companion graphic novel, Sons of Ares, have appeared on lists of books targeted for removal in Missouri and Texas. These challenges often stem from state laws that allow for the, quote, review, unquote, of library materials, which critics argue is used as a tool for passive censorship. Author Pierce Brown has often spoken about the irony of his work being challenged. He views the attempts to restrict the book as a real-world echo of the Golds in his novel, those in power attempting to control what the lower castes are allowed to know or imagine. So, Abby, why did you choose Red Rising for today's episode, and what was your first experience reading it?
I chose Red Rising because I've always loved reading science fiction and fantasy. And this has been something I had read recently. I read it the first time back in December. And then I read the whole series, all the 6 books that are out currently.
The hierarchy of the book is rigid and biological. We see this early on through the contrast between the physicality of the reds in the mines and the sculpted perfection of the golds, like Cassius or Julian. How does Brown use these biological colors to comment on our real world social stratification? Does the fact that they are genetically engineered to be different make the lie of their superiority harder to dismantle than the social classes we see in our own world?
So I think it's definitely a parallel to how class structures are in our current society. The way that people have used in history race as a way to make excuses for segregating individuals and pigeonholing people into certain careers and paths forward is definitely a direct comparison to what we've seen in our own history and currently in the world today. So I think the fact that the colors are genetically modified, it makes it easier for people to use that as an excuse to allow the society to remain so stratified. But when you read further into the series, you can see how even though there are individuals who have been genetically modified to act a certain way, people are still people and they still have their own individual wants, needs, and desires. And regardless of the fact of genetics and how they were born and where they were born into, they still don't always fall into the same lines and places where the society has placed them.
So, Darrow has to master the very systems he hates to stand a chance. A pivotal moment is when he realizes that to lead the House Mars students, he cannot just be quote unquote kind. He has to be a leader who understands the Gold's language of strength and consequence. When he chooses to let Titus be punished, or when he crafts his persona as the Reaper, is he simply using power as a tool, or is he dangerously close to being corrupted by the mechanics of gold supremacy?
So Darrow definitely uses power as a tool in Red Rising and then throughout the series. But then as he uses this power, and as he at first tells himself that he's only using it to blend in and to get ahead, you can see where he starts to become corrupted by the power. And he starts to think of himself more and more as someone who, because he has wielded the power, deserves to continue to use the power, and has this belief that not necessarily is color based, but maybe as a quote unquote like maybe a more of a virtue based, deserving to use that power.
I definitely think you can see that with Darrow because he certainly has moments where, especially as I mentioned, the punishment of Titus, who he's allowing to be punished for rape, I believe, but he lets another one of the students administer the punishment because the punishment thinks Titus is responsible for the murder of his younger brother, when in fact, Darrow is responsible for the murder of the younger brother. The Institute has set up all these students where their first test is they're matched against each other and only one of them is coming out of the room alive. And so it is very, Hunger Games or Lord of the Flies type of a situation that they've been forced into. But you hope, or at least I did, while reading the book, and I've only read the first one in the series. I will probably read the whole series eventually, but I'm not there yet. You hope that Darrow's kind of finds his way back to himself and finds a way to get around these systems of power. But I also recognize, having been in a system of power, that it's awfully hard to act outside of it when you are in it. So the violence at the Institute is visceral. From the culling, which was that first incident where the students are matched against each other and where Darrow is forced to kill Julian Obolona, to the brutal physical hazing within the houses themselves. Some critics argue this brutality is gratuitous. Do you feel this level of violence is necessary to show the true cost of the Gold's regime? Or does the constant, quote, clash of blades, unquote, ever risk overshadowing the book's message about justice and equality?
So I don't think the violence was necessary to get the point across and to show the message. I think I understand why Pierce Brown chose to use the violence, especially in American society, where violence tends to be very almost like whitewashed. It tends to be cleansed. I think Pierce Brown wants to show a more harsh version of violence that doesn't always have a point, as a counter to how people like to use violence in books and in societies to show that there's a there's a reason behind this violence and that we're furthering a certain goal. Whereas Pierce Brown chose to use violence as to show it's almost pointless to use violence because of the gratuitous nature of how he uses it.
Well, and I think if people are going to go after the gratuitousness of violence, it's not books where they should start. It should probably be some of the action movies that even I am guilty of watching action movies, and especially some of the superhero movies where entire cities are destroyed and that sort of thing. Are you familiar with a book called Hench?
Mm-mm.
Well, it's a fun read, but also one of the plot points is someone who has been kind of a mercenary henchman. She hires herself out as a henchman. She starts to calculate the damage that all these superheroes do when they are allegedly fighting all of these villains. And it's actually a great twist on all of that gratuitous violence. Highly recommend. But anyway, getting back to the book at hand, this book is frequently challenged in school districts. Looking at the scene where Darrow first sees the surface of Mars and realizes that the quote, great lie, unquote, he's been told his whole life. Why do you think this specific narrative of unlearning official history scares certain school boards? Is it the graphic nature of the combat they fear? Or is it the idea that a quote, low, unquote, color can successfully infiltrate an elite establishment and outthink people who are allegedly intellectually superior?
I would say it's more so of the latter, right? I think it's more so that there can be a paradigm shift implemented by someone of a quote low unquote class, that they can rise up and create a movement in the upper class, in the higher tiered level of society. Someone who was not born into that society can then manipulate them so well and to create chaos and to sow discontent.
Well, and I also have to wonder whether this is also a reaction to the idea of assimilation, at least in our culture. Granted, Darrow assimilates to a great degree by undergoing a lot of surgeries and a physical transformation. His brain is already there and he can outthink the Reds in certain degrees, but his physical body has all these surgeries to get to this point where he looks like their social ideal, at least for the Golds. And I think what in our class system in the United States, I think we demand that people assimilate as they change social class. You're supposed to have certain manners. There are some topics you don't talk about. There are some things that you are supposed to do or supposed to have, and you're supposed to assimilate to a different norm than if you'd stayed in your previous socioeconomic class. And I guess it also works the other way. If you were coming from a more economically affluent social class and you are suddenly thrust into a lower class, you might be seen as a snob if you acted in certain ways. I do think that Brown is also making a statement about social mobility, which in his book is very rigid. You're not supposed to be able to change your color ever. However, in the United States, we have this, I guess, ideal of social mobility that anybody can change social classes, especially moving up. But the reality is that very few people actually do change social class in their lifetime. In the mines, the Reds are controlled by a total lack of information. They don't even know the stars are reachable. This theme of controlled information is central to modern book challenges. How does Darrow's journey from a closed information system to an open one serve as a metaphor for the importance of intellectual freedom and the dangers of curated truths?
So I think one of the ways that his transformation and change from a closed system to an open system is this feeling of betrayal he has towards the system in general, and how before he was unhappy with the system, but he wasn't completely burn it all to the ground. He was more willing to die and give up than fight back. But once he learns the truth and learns how he was lied to and how pointless so many of the deaths he experienced were, then he became much more willing to fight back and to try to dismantle the system that had oppressed him for so long.
And I think he also learned an important lesson about trust and the people he could trust or could not trust, and what kind of ties they had, particularly family, that may or may not make them trustworthy. I don't want to spoil anything about the book, so I don't want to say anything more about that. But I thought that that was really a well done portion. And it's toward the end of the book where Darrow has to trust someone and everything works out okay. We'll just put it that way. At least in that situation, there are, I'm sure, many more challenges to come since it's an ongoing series. So, what is the one core message or final thought that you want to leave our listeners with regarding Red Rising?
I like to just remind people that a lot of what Darrow is facing and a lot of what the society is facing in Red Rising is very much applicable to what we are going through today, and that we have certain individuals attempting to influence nations and people into thinking that they have a right to things because of how they were born and the socioeconomic economic status that they hold. That's not necessarily true, and that you don't have to always be stuck in their paradigm.
Yeah, I think that's a good insight that we're all human beings. We should all have equal rights and equal opportunities. But because of the circumstances of our birth, or sometimes the socioeconomic circumstances that we find ourselves in, we don't necessarily have those equal rights or equal opportunities. So I'm really glad to see that I guess it's a science fiction book, maybe it's a fantasy book, maybe it's a combination of both. I am glad to see that there are authors out there that are still taking on this cause because it's really an important one. Well, Abby, thank you for joining me on Booked and Banned. Our next episode will be a discussion of Molokai by Alan Brennert. Thank you all for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whisper truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into common ground. Booked and banned, come take my hand, we're rebels with a paperback